Hi guys, it's me Countess and I'm back. Hello, hello, hello my lovelies. Okay, so we've got a bit to tackle today in this video. So it's not really going to be like original content today. This is content that I find imperative that you guys know. Just in case you can't get the material, I will read this one chapter in this book called Behind the Wall of Illusion, the religious, occult, and esoteric world of the Beatles. Such a good book. I bought it about a year ago, and it's a lot to get through. But there is a chapter in this book that I think is very important. So, on my channel, we've been talking a lot about the counterculture and how the Beatles were definitely the high priest of the counterculture, along with Leary and Ginsberg and all those creeps. But that's another video I'm thinking about making, is investigating more on Billy and William Burroughs' relationship. But that's to come at another time. Yeah, so I just kind of like want to talk about, the post-World War II world. So different to what it is, like our world is today, right? And I think everybody can agree on that one, right? So I just think about the shift and how it slowly started, and you think about the Beatles and their influences, their personal influences. We don't really know much about the Masonic side of it or the hush-hush societies about it, but they did have some, environmental influences on their sort of view of the world. John had the duality, basically, of his free-loving and, liberal mama versus his strict, neurotic, and controlling Aunt Mimi. When he lost his mom, he lost his window into that world, and resented it a lot, and resented society, especially, an off-duty policeman was drunk and killed her. He then planted a seed for him to hate authority. So, and then we go to Paul and Paul's father, Jim McCartney. Once Paul's mom died, he just gave up on going to church. I've even seen quotes of him saying that he didn't believe in God. All he believes in is what he sees in front of his face, stuff like that. George was born into and baptized into the Catholic Church. That's another thing at that time, and even still today, I'm sure. The tensions and the polarization of the Protestants and the Catholics was just crazy, 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 crazy. So much discrimination going on against the Catholics. So the Catholics started getting sort of influenced by the Protestants, and they were starting to kind of become a little bit more liberal in a sense. And so George just always thought of going to church as just kind of like a mundane ritual. He didn't get any sort of spiritual satisfaction out of that. So that's a seed planted. And then in Ringo's case, I look at it as he was brought up by a single mom, and she just probably wanted the best for her son. Being a single mother raising a boy is, you can imagine, very challenging. So she just wanted the best for her son. And yeah, so he was kind of like, he was not grounded in any kind of religion. So it was very easy that when these four, came together finally as a group, um, it's no surprise that they denounced their Christian beliefs and helped propagate an agenda to bring Christianity down. And we know that from memoirs. Billy tells us straight up that the guys at the top, they're, you know, just maniacal and they're the ones who are in control. They're the ones who run the show. So I lost my train of thought right there, guys. I'm sorry. It happens to me. Anyways, I just wanted to talk about this sort of mindset because when the Beatles came onto the scene, Kennedy had just gotten assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated, especially when the Beatles came to America. When they came to America, it was over because the American public needed another idol to worship, as it were. Idols. But the four of them actually became one unit, a square, if you will, as Billy puts it. And they definitely, I want to say that they were puppets for the controllers. Everybody wants to say that John was rebellious, he didn't give a shit, and blah, blah. No, these guys were sworn to secret oaths to push these agendas. The men up top wanted to wage a war on Christianity, and it started. It's the boiling frog syndrome all over again. You got the late 40s. All of the 50s was just full of consumerism, materialistic bullshit attached to daily lives, became expectations for people, and that's definitely not the world that we live in nowadays. Nowadays your kids really struggle to get out on their own. Parents struggle to equip their kids with how to make it on their own. And it's just very, very different total mindset. And it started when these guys came over across the pond and blew away everybody. And the whole significance of Beatlemania mirrors ancient history. And that's what I want to read in this passage of Behind the Wall of Illusion by Sean McLeod. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. I've read it a few times, and that's what I'm saying. Like, I really think that this chapter and this information is entertaining and sort of enlightening too, to the whole social engineering that the Beatles psyop conducted on the world population, not even just the American public. It was the world, the wide, wide world. So sit back, grab a beverage, and if you would like to hear all of this amazing information, I will see you guys on the other side, as always. Thanks for watching. Bye, guys. Beatlemania and the Cult of Dionysus. As well as filling a void left in the socio-political environment of America during the early 60s, the Beatles also represented the changing attitudes in personal affairs, in the new youth culture, and the release of sexual tensions and explorations that had been unhealthily suppressed during the post war Anglo American culture, and without a doubt, as a response to changing attitudes towards women after the war. Due to the Beatles' comfortable and sensitive aura, sex became approachable and enjoyable as opposed to horrifying and full of penalties. Pent up energy and hormones surfaced in the form of rebellion and global lust, and challenged the notion that women were to remain pure and domestic. The change in opinion and comfort levels furthered the gap between the old fashioned conservative ideology from the new progressive thinking. The Beatles unleashed dormant sexual urges that manifested themselves like a Dionysian rite, in which girls seemed to behave like Mayans, the priestesses that oversaw the Dionysian rites. In Greek mythology, the Maenads, mad women, or raving ones, often portrayed with supernatural associations, were inspired by Dionysus into a state of ecstatic frenzy through a combination of dancing and intoxication. Dionysus, or Bacchus, who incarnated the androgynous young male, a catalyst of wild energy, was the link between new raw sappy growth, crowd ecstasy, wild dance, wild nature, drink, illusion and hallucination, madness, tragic theater, and violence maddened his worshippers. The Maenads, who tore up live animals and expressed their suddenly abnormal consciousness in hallucinating and crazy dance, with the aim of removing inhibitions and social constraints, liberating the individual to return to a natural state. Intoxication, physical or spiritual, the initiate recovers an intensity of feeling which prudence had destroyed. He finds the world full of delight and beauty, and his imagination is suddenly liberated from the prison of everyday preoccupations. The Bacchic ritual produced what was called enthusiasm, which means etymologically having the god enter the worshiper, who believed that he became one with the god. Rock and roll, as a live performance, was very much a part of, was written for Dionysus's festival. The musicologist Ruth Padel writes that drink, drugs, ecstatic loss of self, and illusion of every kind, especially drink and madness, violent dance, crowds, theatrical spectacle, and violence as a summary of 60s rock. Dionysus couldn't be bettered. In the 60s, popular culture made him the figurehead for male rock god. In January of 1964, a month before the band first stepped foot on American soil, Life reported, "A beetle who ventures out unguarded into the streets runs the very real peril of being dismembered or crushed to death by his fans." When the Beatles officially arrived in the United States a mere 2 months after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, thousands of fans specifically young females, enthusiastically greeted them by storming the Kennedy Airport in New York. Sure, there had been less fan frenzies for musicians and celebrities in the past, but nothing to the extent of Beatlemania. Had caused a common, Elvis had caused a commotion a decade before, but his image and character remained censored with the Beatles. What people saw is what people got. The act of pulling at the Beatles, pulling their clothes, or pulling their own hair seemed to suggest the activities at such rites in which the Maenads would pull apart the flesh of the resurrected Dionysus. The fact that the Beatles often barely got away with their lives when they were surrounded or pursued by hormonal teenage girls. An unearthly howl went up from thousands of possessed teenagers. Girls began pulling their hair out, pupils dilating, shaking uncontrollably. Clinical Dionysian mass hysteria was breaking out everywhere. The plays, which handled myths of Dionysus, show how intrinsic violence was to him. Someone always gets torn to pieces. Orpheus gets torn into pieces as women follow him as moths follow flame. The figure who gets torn apart is always male, and Dionysus's women, Maenads, his mad followers, do the tearing. But the figure who inspires them to madness and violence is the young male, followed by crowds of women. He maddens them, but also mirrors the figure they destroy. The gods of music and theater are the two gods of violent dismembering. Rock and roll had unleashed essentially the forces of Dionysus, and this ultimately reached its peak expression in Beatlemania, when the girls would scream wildly in their concerts, pull out their hair, and rip up the clothes from the band if they could have. In fact, the energies were so intoxicating that it seemed to verge on being violent, maniacal, as, as if, like in the Dionysian rite, the Maenads would tear Dionysus limb from limb in order for him to rise again out of his own death. The frenzy of Beatlemania was, in this sense, a dying and rebirth, an orgy of ecstasy in which young girls could emerge through orgasm brought on by the social frenzy of Beatle concerts and emerged as women, losing their innocence with their first experience of sex. The Beatles, having a strong femininity to them, were safe and dangerous at the same time, and the girls could find a sociably acceptable environment, particularly at live shows, to allow their newly discovered sexuality to unravel, often in the forms of hysterical communal screaming and orgasms. The girls themselves could form their own Beatle focused social groups in which one girl may like Paul, another John, and a third Ringo, thus allowing the girls to have the same fantasies or shared fantasies without encroaching on the fantasies of the other. They could join their fantasies together, in which two girls of the same group could imagine they were married to a Beatle, touring together and possibly living together, as that was how the Beatles were perceived, especially in their films A Hard Day's Night and Help. This would be typical, as Ruth Padel suggests, of pop music's ability to transpose the teenage mind into the theater of Dionysus, in which these myths are played out like Greek myth. Pop song is all about relationships, staged in the teenage mind rather than the theater of Dionysus. The whole project is focused on an intensely teenage search for identity through music, and the currency of its lyrics is relationship. The Beatles, in a very religious way, gave purpose to the meaning to this new generation of lost souls. The sexual aspects of Beatlemania were not just something of a crude erotic nature, but something life affirming, an expression of the life force and of an element of human being that was suppressed, damaged, and unhealthily distorted by a prudish, overly unfeeding, and cold society. A society controlled by intellect and reason and afraid of the emotional power of the feminine. The English poet Philip Larkin would express such an idea when he wrote his poem Anos Mirabilis. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of Chatterley Ban and the Beatles' first LP. Of course, sexual intercourse had been around forever, but Larkin is referring to its sudden awakening in the human psyche as something very personal and emotional, not just a Darwinian matter of function and duty, which society has turned it into. The Beatles and the pill Larkin is suggesting were the catalysts for a whole generation awakening their sexual impulses as well as their inner emotional life, independent of societal duties, concerns, repressions, and taboos. The Beatles wiped these all away and freed their post war baby boomers from these social constraints. Dionysus is also called Eleutheros, the liberator, whose wine music and ecstatic dance frees his followers from self conscious fear and care and subverts the oppressive restraints of the powerful. Those who partake of his mysteries are possessed and empowered by the God himself. He is represented by city religions as the protector of those who do not belong to the conventional society and thus symbolizes everything which is chaotic, dangerous, and unexpected, everything which escapes human reason and which can only be attributed to the unforeseeable actions of the gods. In this sense, Dionysus was the beast god within, or the unconscious mind of modern psychology. Such activity has been interpreted as fertilizing, invigorating, cathartic, liberating, and transformative. So it is not surprising that many devotees of Dionysus were those on the margins of society: women, slaves, outlaws, and foreigners, non citizens in Greek democracy. All were equal in a cult that inverted their roles. The adolescent attraction towards music and intoxication, often through alcohol, was significant in the development of the teenager and is closely linked to the cult of Dionysus. The Beatles would, through music and dance, intoxicate their audience, as their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show would perfectly indicate, with 73 million Americans enraptured for those 15 minutes while the Beatles performed. Seeing the Beatles, said one celebrity, was a revelation, and saw them and seeing them as opening the door for individual freedom, despite class, race, or sex. The music spoke to the audience as if it were written for each individual on a personal level, which further bonded fans together as a community. At times, the music was playful, lively, and full of high energy, while also being soft, soulful, and reflective, just like those groups of social outcasts. Welcome to the Dionysian rites. The trance induction central to the cult involved not only chemonosis, i.e., transformation, usually consciousness through chemical substances or alteration of biochemical substances in the human being, but also an invocation of spirit. In the Dionysian cult, this would be through communal dancing to music, to the drum and pipe, and with the bull roarer, an unusual vibrating instrument, while characteristic movements such as the backward head flick, found in all trance inducing cults, such as Afro American voodoo, for example, were also a part of the transforming effect. Interestingly, it was the famous head flick of the Beatles, equivalent to Elvis's pelvic thrust, that would have the girls screaming in frenzy. In some cults, Dionysus arrives from the east as an Asiatic foreigner, and others from Ethiopia in the south. He is a god of epiphany, the god that comes, and his foreignness as an arriving outsider god may be inherent and essential to his cults. Thus, the Beatles arriving in America in 1964 and returning to Britain following the media hype of their American tour is an expression of the Dionysian myth of the god of Epiphany. While the figure of Dionysus would be consciously expressed in the latter half of the 60s, mainly through figures like Mick Jagger, Jim Morrison, who gladly took on the identity of the god, and later by individuals like Iggy Pop, Ozzy Osbourne, and to some extent Sid Vicious, and more recently in Bono's The Fly and Mistopheles characters. The Beatles' early live performance clearly captured a sense of the Dionysian rites, and the Beatles, like Elvis, seemed to channel the energy of Dionysus unconsciously and as an intuitive reflection of the 60s cultural evolution. The Beatles, in other words, were an authentic vehicle, both for the frantic impulses of the deity, which was completely outside their control, as well as the rejuvenating force of the same impulse that came through them, often in their early years unconsciously. In fact, it is the very nature of Dionysus to be unconscious and out of control, an attempt which led people like Jim Morrison to try and control it, but which ultimately led to his own destruction. When the Beatles performed live on Ed Sullivan, it was both a response to a need triggered by their arrival in America, while simultaneously creating a social context, particularly for young people, that hadn't been possible before. Girls as well as boys began to form their own groups. The girls began to occupy a space not before open to them. One space was that of the rock musician, in which the girl was not just confined to the position of the singer. These girls, although often criticized, would take up the guitar, bass, and drums, thus emulating the lineup of the Fab Four and thus exerting their own power. In England, R&B groups like the Liverbirds formed, and future punks like Vivian Albertine found a freedom in the Beatles and a sign that they, as women, could too seek out a career in rock and roll. This trend would later inspire groups like the Runaways, the Bangles in America, providing a new generation of girls on their way to womanhood with new role models. The Beatles engaged in behavior that elicits the rapturous response from the young female audience, which brought the Beatles to fame. The Beatles, says Bradby, were told what to say and said what girls wanted to hear. It wasn't only girls that the Beatles affected in this respect, but the androgynous nature of the group with their long hair, high pitched singing style, as well as the communal and fashion element of the Beatles, unleashed certain feelings and attitudes in males that had not found expression in the Anglo American cultures of the time. As the Book of Pop describes, boys often seeming small, pretty, peacocked preened, girls often appearing tougher, with hair sometimes boyishly cropped and wearing less exotic garb. The boys rainbow arrayed with elaborate coils of hair, clothes in different colors and fabrics. Boys and girls together, who can tell them apart? Who wants to be a part? Who plays which role now? The Beatles allowed young girls to feel more comfortable with their newfound sexuality, while simultaneously allowed young boys an opportunity to explore their feminine side without being railroaded into the traditional view of the militaristic values of manhood, where self-expression was taboo. Douglas saw the Beatles as a kind of interfusion of the girl groups of the early 60s, which offered the teen and preteen girls of the time a mirror on which their own inner lives were made manifest, and in turn provided role models for these young girls. The males of the time finding the opposite to be so for them. They were they could emulate malehood through the Beatles, but at the same time express their emotions often through music, clothes, personal appearance, especially the long hair, another attribute to religious freedom and connections to the cosmos. Consider Samson and his long hair from the Bible. Long hair has traditionally been connected to a notion of clairvoyance, which was cut out by the reasoning mind of the Enlightenment, a fact which was often bemoaned by a true, unacknowledged legislatures of the world, the poets who would embrace the illogical, the irrational, and the supernatural. poetry often considered feminine in its nature. Dancing, another Dionysian mode of expression, encouraged by the music of the Beatles, was also viewed in a similar manner to poetry and a kind of cosmic consciousness, an emotional expression that is beyond the control of rational thought. The boys, too, wrote songs that would suggest their envy at the Beatles, while at the same time expressed a desire to be just like them. What the Beatles were possibly achieving in this breaking down of the barriers, not only to class and race, but also between the sexes, as McCartney would claim when he stated, short hair for men, long hair for women. We got rid of that convention for the Americans. They pointed to the androgynous nature of the human being, which is expressed in esoteric terms, is made up of a physical body and also a subtle body known as the etheric body, a spiritual aspect of the human being that is often the opposite sex to the physical body. The Beatles allowed the etheric element of the teenage fan find an expression in the personality of the physical being and thus created a unified androgynous human individual, the new Adam, as the poet William Blake would name it, in which the human being was, in a non sexual sense, balancing the yin and the yang elements of masculine and feminine within them. The imagery of sexual warfare is central to the vision of apocalypse, which William Blake proclaims as his poetic mission. The political apocalypse of the earlier work, such as the French Revolution, fades as the spiritual gains prominence. By the time he was writing Jerusalem, the only apocalypse he could endorse was one in which the sexes must cease and vanish in the psyche so that humanity can assume its spiritualized body. William Blake's prophetic poems were enormously popular in the 1960s. These poems promise that after the apocalypse, young men will regain their polymorphous, perverse sexuality and live in a state of eternal bliss. But in the less euphoric 1970s, feminists argued that this androgynous utopia was inherently misogynistic. Androgyny would become a major aspect of 60s culture, particularly in the latter half of it, but which by the 70s, and though individualized in celebrities like David Bowie, it became a solely sexual concern. In other words, the spiritual androgyny which Blake points to and which finds expression in the Beatles becomes perverted into a purely sexual idea which Bowie and others used to enhance their careers. Yes, so that is the end of what I wanted to read to you guys from this book. It's from chapter 3, and it's just two uh, sort of points in this chapter about the relationship between the Beatles and the cult of Dionysus, and speaking about androgyny in society. And it's more of a spiritual androgyny, right? They're not talking about the transsexual movement, but you know that obviously plays into the whole concept of androgyny and the inversion of the sexes that the mystery schools have pushed since ancient times. That is the materia prima of the magnum opus, guys. Androgyny. It is alchemy at its purest point, and it is the starting point for transformation and rebirth. And that's exactly what we were just talking about at the beginning of this excerpt from the book. So, all of this comes together, and I believe we are sort of at the head of it now because all of this stuff, instead of being taken as a spiritual and or psychological matter, it's being inverted into a physical matter in society. So I think we've lost, well, like with everything in modern society, we've lost the spiritual aspect of it. Um, that's the thing now. The baby boomers created this world of consumerism and capitalism that has created this polarization in society nowadays. And it's a scary thing because, all of the ideas that are being pushed in the last century and at the beginning of this century, what kind of effects will they have in 50 years? That the same effects, similar to the effects that the counterculture had on all of us as a result of us succeeding in generations. So, just something to think about, when you're looking at old Beatles footage, or you're sitting in your car jamming out to the Beatles, right? This is an initiation into the cult of Dionysus, and the music is there to put you in a trance and to open up the floodgates of your sexuality. Free love, man. Everybody's doing it. Anyways, guys, I just really thought that this was interesting and it definitely correlates with everything that I've discussed on my channel thus far. Just showing the residual effects of the 1960s counterculture movement, and it all came from post war mentality. So I have to wonder, if and when we do go into the third world war, how are we going to be left after that war subsides? They use war for money and for power, but they also use it for influence, to influence the profane and the low layman of the world. Yeah. So, anyways, guys, let me know what you guys think about this excerpt. I highly recommend you go out and get it. You can actually, and I will include it in the description, you can get a free PDF download of it. So I'll try to look back and see where I found my free download of the book, and I'll try to include it in the description down below. So please give me your comments. Thank you to any new subscribers. Thank you to the old subscribers. Thanks for coming back and spending a little bit of time with me, guys. Until the next video, I will see you guys later. Bye.